Support for WUWM podcasts comes from Hop Harvest and Vine and Good Harvest Market in Milwaukee, part of One Destination, combining farm-to-table dining, local craft beers, and organic groceries under one roof. More at goodharvestmarket.com.
Lake Effect brings you conversations about what's happening in Milwaukee and the people, places, and organizations that shape our community. This is Lake Effect Spotlight from WUWM, Milwaukee's NPR.
Last summer, a woman working as a teacher's aide at a public school in Milwaukee was forced to self-deport to her native country of El Salvador. Yessenia Ruano and her husband Miguel Guerra chose uncertain safety over the constant fear of detainment after a decade-old deportation order for Yessenia rose to the surface. Immigration officials did not honor her pending application for a visa reserved for trafficking victims. Now, the couple and their young twin daughters are trying to create a new life in a country that feels foreign to all four of them. Milwaukee Journal Sentinel reporter Sophie Carson visited the family in their new home in San Alfonso, El Salvador. Carson joins WUWM education reporter Katherine Kokal to share her reporting.
So it's been 6 months now that Yessenia and her daughters, Paola and Elizabeth, have been living in El Salvador. Her husband, Miguel, left his job in Milwaukee and joined them a few months later. Can you tell me what their new life is like in El Salvador?
Yeah, it's very different from their life in Milwaukee. That was something I really wanted to find out when I went there. It's different in many ways. The family just doesn't have the level of sort of independence they had previously. They own their home. Yessenia and Miguel were working. The girls were going to school. They kept their evenings busy. In the story I write, like they went to trampoline parks. They went to the playground. They went to dance class. And the girls were very active, in school. And Yessenia was very active in her church. But now they first lived with Yessenia's mother in the mountains, in a rural mountain village. And now they live closer to the coast with Miguel's mother, her mother-in-law. They live in just one room, the four of them in one room, 3 twin beds pushed together. It's very hot in the house, but that room has air conditioning. And so the girls will start school when the school year starts in January in El Salvador. It's a 4-hour school day. The girls finished 4th grade in Milwaukee, but they really are kind of going in blind to this new school year. They don't know much about Salvadoran history or geography, and they speak Spanish. They went to a bilingual school in Milwaukee where Yessenia was also a teacher's aide called ALBA, but the whole world is different for them in many ways. So Yessenia is currently working at a convenience store that is kind of attached to her mother-in-law's home. And she and Miguel are taking a pastry course that's offered for free by the government for returning Salvadorans who were deported. So they are, trying to figure out what their next steps are and trying to figure out how to kind of rebuild their lives.
Yeah. You write that their life now is a series of contradictions. Can you share a little bit about what that means?
I think that the country in general is undergoing this really interesting transition where there is, a big wealth disparity. There is a lot of foreign investment and foreign tourism coming into the country. At the same time, much of the country is still, developing. It's still incredibly poor. Still recovering from the effects of its long civil war and, rampant gang violence. It's something that is a real interesting contradiction. At the same time, we spoke to a local reporter there who said, the government just opened a free hospital for pets, a free animal hospital. And he said, there's this really interesting issue where regular Salvadoran humans can't get the healthcare they need, but they're opening a free hospital for pets. And so it's there's the currency there is US dollars and Bitcoin. They're really rapidly evolving. There's a lot of foreign tourism. The hostel we were staying at, which is owned by Yessenia's aunt and uncle, we had a Swiss woman stay there who's been coming for a number of years. And Yessenia's cousin is a surf instructor who teaches surfing to, tourists, foreign tourists. So there's a lot of mix of developing and developed, and that, I think, for Yessenia and Miguel is a really interesting thing to come back into.
I think people make a similar observations when they talk about the haves and have-nots being within spitting distance of each other. And Yessenia and Miguel kind of represent this group of people who were haves, right? They moved to the U.S. You shared that they sent money back to family members in El Salvador. And now they are in a place where they're getting boxes of their belongings from their home in Milwaukee, and they don't even have a place to put them. They are completely useless to them. An ice cream maker, it was an example that you included in the piece. It's fitting a life from the U.S. into their new lives in El Salvador that I would argue they didn't want. They didn't want to return to the country that were both born in, right?
They didn't. They talked about that, they were like, this wasn't our choice. These boxes were, had arrived right as I got there. So it was a really interesting sort of symbol for me of going through what their life was and also learning to sort of accept or fit these bits of their American lives into their new life. So I kind of got lucky in that regard. That was a good symbol, but it was also just practically a real challenge for them. Like I said, they're living in one small room in in her mother-in-law's house, and there's a lot of other people living in that house, and there just was no room for this. So they really are just step by step figuring it out, and I think they were really. The reason I'm telling their story is because it's representative of what many other people are going through. So it's not that they specifically are the only ones going through this, but I think there's many people who are going through things like this.
There's a lot of reporting in the U.S. right now about what happens before someone leaves the country, right? We're seeing these images of people being detained when they're coming to court appearances. We see people being hustled into vans in places like Home Depot parking lots. There's a lot of reporting and kind of access to people who are being removed from the country. There's not a lot of reporting about what it's like after someone leaves the United States. Why was it important to tell this story now?
I think that you make a very good point. There was not a lot of reporting, and I still have not seen very much reporting, in depth about what it's like to be back. I think in the U.S., I understand why. We're very focused on our policies, how our taxpayer dollars are being used to fund ICE operations or federal agencies. But from just a human perspective, I was really interested in her story. She's a very compelling person in that she's very friendly. She's incredibly hopeful. Even now, she's hopeful that she can return to the U.S. And her story, I think, struck a chord in Milwaukee because she was this person who had no criminal convictions. She had, U.S. citizen children. She was working in a public school legally. So there was a lot of community support for her. And so, as we were kind of thinking about, how do you tell her story next? It just made sense to try to go, and it was a long shot, but being with someone day in and day out, you can really see the rhythm of their lives and sort of how they're adjusting, how they're making do, and that is something you can't really get over, say, a Zoom call or a phone call. So I just kept in touch with her since she left, as well as her other friends have done the same. Her church community, her teacher friends. Everyone's really kept in touch with her. And so it's been interesting to be able to keep telling that story.
If you're just joining us, today we're hearing from Sophie Carson, a reporter at the Milwaukee Journal Sentinel. She recently traveled to El Salvador, where she met with Yessenia Ruano. She's a former Milwaukee Public Schools teaching aide who was forced to carry out her own deportation of her and her two 10-year-old daughters earlier this year. There's still a lot of hurt in this family, though. You chronicle it throughout the several stories that you put together for this project. And it also seems like Yessenia and Miguel are very torn on what their future looks like and how to move forward. You mentioned that Yessenia is very hopeful, but how does that show up? How do they disagree on what their lives should and will look like?
I think this is one of the, central tensions that I hope to convey in this story, which was that, Miguel, he was under the radar in the U.S. He didn't have papers, and he was working in Milwaukee. But, he has accepted the reality that he's back in El Salvador. I mean, he says she's not defeated. And when I spoke to him about that, she was in the other room, and I asked her the next day, and are you defeated? And she said, well, no, like I see the reality. I'm trying to accept it, but it's very difficult. I mean, life here is very difficult. And she also has this ongoing federal lawsuit regarding her T visa, her trafficking victims visa, through a California immigration advocacy group. And she that lawsuit argues that her deportation should have not happened and that it was illegal to deport her with this ongoing application. She still holds out a little bit of hope that will result in her being able to come back to the U.S. At the same time, she can't just sit around and wait for that, She has to keep living her life. She has to keep going to the grocery store and coming up with a new way to earn a living and taking her, entertaining her children and keeping them occupied and all this stuff. How do you fill a day when you're not in school and you're not working? And, they're really just trying to figure out how to build their lives. And for Yessenia, at the same time, she's still struggling to accept that new reality.
You mentioned that she doesn't have any criminal convictions. We've heard kind of over and over again that the Trump administration is going after people who represent, quote, the worst of the worst. She doesn't really seem to fit that bill. What does her story mean in the context of this greater immigration crackdown?
It's a great question. I think her story is really representative of, many of the people who have been targeted and forced to leave the country under Trump's expanded deportation crackdown. We hear a lot about the worst of the worst. We hear a lot about the people with criminal convictions or violent criminal records. Yessenia was not one of those people, and she was not even charged with illegal reentry. She did cross the border twice. She was not charged with illegal reentry on her second entry because she said she had a fear of returning to El Salvador. So she spent pretty much 14 years, her entire time in the U.S., waiting for a decision in her cases to be able to hopefully earn a legal status and stay in the U.S. So, when I spoke to her friends in Milwaukee, what they said was she really was representative of the kind of complex process that many immigrants go through in trying to gain a legal status, trying to remain in the U.S., trying to make it work. And that, when we hear about, well, why didn't she just come the right way? Or she had 14 years to become a U.S. citizen. Why didn't that happen? They really said this was a big misunderstanding of just how complicated this process is and how, in many cases, it's actually impossible for people in situations like hers to gain a legal status.
Yeah, when you say do it the right way, that is interesting to me. We at WUWM are in the process of releasing a podcast called Status Pending, where we are looking at all of the different ways that people can gain access to citizenship or not in many cases. We have episodes about refugees and asylum seekers, as well as people who use the family pathways. And the kind of common thread among this podcast is that this is an incredibly expensive process and it takes a really long time and you're kind of in limbo for a really long time. And so it sounds like, in those 14 years that she was in the country, it is not as easy as people may think when they say you should do it the right way.
Yes, the gist is that her case is representative of this, many of the people swept up in the larger Trump deportation crackdown. And also, she was one of few people who's been willing to speak out about it. One of few immigrants who's been, really prominently willing to share her story and be open and transparent about what happened and how she got to where she is.
That was Journal Sentinel reporter Sophie Carson, speaking with WUWM education reporter Katherine Kokal. Carson, along with photographer Giovanni Hernandez, reported on a Milwaukee teacher's aide who was forced to deport to El Salvador.
You can find more interviews like this one by visiting WUWM.com/Lake Effect. And while you're there, subscribe to the Lake Effect Spotlight podcast.